Good afternoon, Dzień dobry, or perhaps more appropriately today I should say ni hao, because we're going to look at some Chinese swords. Now, I'm a fan of buying military surplus stuff. You can get some really good deals. If you want like a sweet camo t-shirt, maybe a Polish gas mask to protect you from the virus, you know, surplus Russian helmet to smash in like I've done on a previous video, or even a good old AK-47 bayonet from Mother Russia itself. However, today we're specifically looking at this item here which I found on eBay. You can get these fairly cheaply, so I took a gamble and purchased one just to see what the quality is like. This is a Chinese Saber from the modern day era army. Apparently these were in production from roughly the 50s and they're still in production to this day. Obviously it's not a vintage model, I can afford one, but this is a modern production, so we're going to have a look. Okay, let's look at this Chinese Army Saber. Now, the first thing that comes to mind here is the handle. It's shaped relatively like it's influenced by the British sabers. It's got this little bulge here to grip onto. Also is this leather loop. Now, I haven't seen too many of these on the sabers and other swords I'm used to. I've read online that referred to as a finger loop, so I can only assume that the index finger is secured inside as such, and thus a more British style grip is used rather than a hammer grip. The scabbard is like the rest of the fittings, classic military green, with a bit of leather here I assume to hang on to, and some belt loops. They seem pretty standard. Another interesting part here is the guard. It's designed obviously for a right-handed user, but it flares up and outward, which is kind of reminiscent of the Chinese old-fashioned dolls. Now, obviously this is a European style sword as interpreted through the Chinese, but however most European style swords, this guard would flare back around over the hand a bit rather than up and out. I can only assume that the design here is, as with the traditional Chinese doll, is for all the blood that's going to be pouring down the blade to collect and just run off down here. Obviously, as you're slicing through all the dissidents and counter-revolutionaries, it can be messy work for the Red Army. Of course, the most important part of any sword is the good old blade. So when we have a look, do you want to take it out there? Just go. There, go. What are you doing? Take it out. Take it out. Pull it out. Okay, okay. It's kind of a trick here. As you can see, there's this little button here. Apparently the Chinese army felt like it needed to child-proof their swords. So it will not actually be retrieved from the sheath unless you press this in, presumably with your thumb. And there it is. So what do you think?
Well, that's cool.
I'm afraid not. It's relatively disappointing. Alright, now I must admit I was very disappointed at this blade. Now, it's got a nice mirror finish. It's got a full way across, and it looks good. However, once you turn it over, as you can see, there is literally no distal taper along the entire edge. It's just a flat piece of metal. Now, I'm not sure about the quality of the steel, whether or not it's worth putting an edge on it and test cutting, because I honestly don't think it's going to cut well at all, considering that the foible is just as thick as the fort down here, and it's just not weighted in a way that you'd assume would cut well at all. It really just feels like a swinging a stick. This is where Distal Taper makes all the difference between a practical, usable blade and something that's just for ceremony, which I suspect this is. Obviously the Chinese army is not charging into battle with nothing but sabers. They have all sorts of other weapons, probably don't even charging on. They probably just use drones these days. So, however, even though in the 1950s when these were a new addition to the army, perhaps then they would have been a quality fighting blade. However, I can't afford to buy a vintage model, as that runs up around $2,000 on the internet. These ones here, these modern day productions, go from anywhere between $400 and all the way down to $100. I purchased this on the low end. I got this for the bare minimum because it's a bit of a gamble. It's unknown quality. It could be a very nice cheap sword to find, or it could be what it is, relatively ordinary. I definitely wouldn't pay $400 for one of these. However, if you are a military enthusiast and you can see one cheap enough, maybe you might well get one just for a collectible item, because despite being impractical, it does look very, very nice. Now, it wasn't always like this. The Chinese army used to have a very terrifying and well-known sword back in the pre-World War II era. Let's look at the legendary Chinese war sword. Now, of course, that's not what they're actually called. That's just the name Cold Steel had for their particular model. And they done a YouTube video which has got a lot of views where they colored them a lot of pig carcasses with them, because these are quite a powerful weapon. The Chinese themselves call this a Wu Da Do or a Mong Dai Do, depending on whether you're speaking Mandarin or Cantonese. However, both names mean exactly the same thing: military big knife. And that's essentially what we got here. We've got a big knife, saber if you will, made for actual war. The soldiers drilled with these pre-World War II, and there were divisions which actually engaged the enemy with these. Now, we're going to have a look at my particular one. Even though it's not World War II era, it's definitely a very older model, perhaps I'd say 70s era. And have a look at how these compare to the rather disappointing modern day sabers they give the Chinese army. Now, this particular one here weighs in at 1.378 kilos, or 79 now. It is a heavy sword on the heavier end, but as you can see, the point of balance is relatively close here to the guard. If you're just looking at this in profile, you would assume that it'd be further down towards the end where it gets quite thick. However, it's well balanced. How is that? Well, two reasons. First and most obviously, Distal Taper. Something lacking from the lame modern day saber by the Chinese army. As you can see, it's enormously thick down here. That is well over 5 mil thick, and it goes all the way down, dramatically narrowing to a relatively thin end. So once you get to this section here of the sword, it's literally like a meat cleaver. The second reason it seems to be so well balanced is they have a bit of weight here at the end. This is all solid steel underneath this cord wrap. The counterweight ring adds just a tiny bit of extra weight balancing out this end, so your point of balance is relatively close to the guard. That is literally roughly the same distance as most Western sabers, a good like 3 or 4 inches from the end of the guard. Let's see how it handles. Now, at almost 1.4 kilos, you'd expect this to handle rather poorly. However, it is quite nimble, even more so than the modern day saber. How is this? Obviously, as I discussed, the point of balance is so much better, and it's also designed for two-handed use. It is very easy to handle one of these. They just feel so light and nippy in the hand despite their weight. Now, the soldiers did drill with this. Certain martial arts schools developed for the army some very rudimentary and basic forms, stripped of most of the decoration of traditional Chinese weapons forms down to the essentials, and taught the soldiers. I happen to know one of these forms, so I can show you very easily just a few demonstration of technique. You begin the form with the sword in this sort of almost soldierly grip. Prepare, guard, slice, 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 parry, attack, retreat, and so on. That's the first line of the soldier's military form for this, which coincidentally the form, if you want to look up, is just called Mong Dai Do as well, just military big knife. The name of the weapon is the name of the form, or kata if you will, for using one of these. So it handles well, It's well balanced, but can it cut? Well, these cut really well, but we're going to find out now anyway. What can I say? This is one of my favourite swords. The Chinese big knife. Military big knife, if you will. It cuts through tatami, no problem. It's very easy to handle, both one hand, two hand, as it's meant to be. It looks good. And it's got a relatively interesting history, considering these were used up until contemporary times in actual combat. What can I say? What's wrong, China? Where'd you go wrong? Why are you issuing your soldiers some wall hangers instead of a nice, good military big knife like this?
What happened to you, China? You used to be cool.
Hey, China's still cool.